Hello and welcome to the Emotion at Work podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. And today's episode is looking at emotion at work in language and meaning, which is a bit of a theme for the podcast recently. We've had, I think this is the fourth podcast where we're looking at language, and we're taking again a slightly different perspective and look at it. And I've had a bit of a bee in my bonnet for a while now about the notion of clean language. I first heard about it when I did my NLP practitioner course, and as a coach, it's something I hear other coaches or I hear at coaching conferences where people talk about clean language, and it bothers me because I don't think language can ever really be clean, because from my point of view, any type of communication has meaning. Even silence will have meaning. So I was really interested in that topic. So before we get into that though, let's welcome our guest to the podcast. So our guest this week is Judy Rees. Hello, Judy.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you.
Good. So Judy and I met online, and we haven't actually met in real life yet. We've had a couple of conversations both online and then over sort of Skype, because I picked up a connection with Judy because she was talking about clean language, and I've already said in my little bit of earlier introduction that I don't buy it really. So I decided, rather than be judgmental and just go, clean language is a load of rubbish, that I'd see if I can have a chat with somebody who talks about clean language to find out more about it, because it might be that whilst I think it's a load of tosh, I might be misunderstanding it or misrepresenting it, or others may be misrepresenting it, and I'm kind of not giving it a fair crack of the whip. So I made contact with Judy, and then we had a chat, and during that conversation that we had, I thought, you know what, this will make a really, really interesting podcast. So we then put a date in the diary to record. So does that give a fair summary of how we've kind of met each other and interacted so far, Judy?
It does, and yes, the sense of it's all a load of tosh, I think, is actually something we connected on, that basically we both think clean language is a load of tosh, or the idea of clean language, some people represent it, is a bit of a load of tosh.
Yes, so that I agree, and I think it's that spectrum of, I can't believe I'm about to introduce a toshiness spectrum, but kind of, what is there behind it, I think, is the bit that I found really interesting about our conversation last time, and again that I'd like to explore today. So the format of this podcast changes from one episode to the next. So our listeners will know that I like to play with the format a little bit. So at least to start with on the podcast, I'm going to hand the hosting duties over to you, Judy, because what I thought would be useful is, rather than talk about clean language in an abstract way, we could see if we could create some part of a conversation that we could then use to unpick this notion of clean language around. So in advance of the podcast, I asked Judy to kind of prepare a couple of questions for me that she can ask me at the start of the podcast, and we can use my responses and my thinking as a way of unpicking, use that as a basis to unpick clean language around. So I have no idea what's coming next. I don't know what Judy's going to ask me. So I am both a mix of kind of excitement and slightly anxious. So I will hand the reins over to you then, Judy, for you to pick it up from here.
Thank you. Well, before I dive into asking you those questions, I think there might be one little tiny piece we need to do for some listeners, because some listeners can't bear to go on without knowing what clean language is. Okay. At one level. And when we say clean language, do you just mean not swearing? There's a little tiny piece of disambiguation that I usually put in at the beginning.
Okay.
The clean language that I'm talking about is not swearing, it's not the software language clean, and it's not quite the NLP idea of clean.
Okay.
It's related to it, but what I'm talking about when I'm talking about clean language is an inquiry technique. It's a precision inquiry technique which was originally designed for exploring the metaphors that underpin people's thinking and that drive their behavior. And that inquiry technique is used increasingly extensively in coaching, in one-to-one conversations.
Okay.
But it's also really good for helping teams and groups to work better together. And that's mostly where I use it. So that I just want to say that to give it a little tiny piece of a frame or else people get a bit lost with this whole thing. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. Yeah, absolutely. And I like the already. I've just written down on my notes to say precision inquiry. I want to come back to that. That's a really interesting way of positioning it. So no, that's good. Thank you. I think that was some useful de-ambiguation. And I didn't have any idea that Clean was a language programming approach either.
I've only ever met one person who knows it as a programming language, but it does exist as a programming language.
Wow. Well, there you go. There's my new thing for today.
Yeah. So so as an inquiry technique, it makes sense for me to ask you a few questions. So
okay.
let me start by asking you something that I would often ask in a team building session. I do lots of team building with this stuff.
Okay.
So I would ask all the members of a team this one question. When you are working at your best, you are like what? So people might be playing along with this at home. But
yes.
For you, Phil, when you are working at your best, you are like what?
So if I take the filter away, then so what I mean by that is a metaphor popped into my mind, and then I didn't like it, but then I couldn't find a better one, so we'll just go with that. So the metaphor that came into mind was a river.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's partly to do with flow.
Mm-hmm.
So and I know there's kind of a notional concept around flow in terms of being immersed in something where time seems to just not have any kind of not meaning, but there's no notional sense of time because you're well anyway. So let me put that one to one side. I'll come back to me. So it's partly to do with flow, being immersed in something that it can both have speed and have calm, that it can be tumultuous and still, that it can be twisty and turny, but it can be fairly straight too. So but it's about being in it and being and working with it. So not being at its whim, and passively moving. It's about being in it and part of it and working really collaboratively with it to create movement, I guess. Mm-hmm. Whether that movement isn't necessarily for me, that could be movement for other people, but when I'm at my best, it's when I am immersed in whatever it is whatever that activity is that I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. So immersed in that activity. And when you're immersed like that, and the metaphor that came into your mind was a river, and you didn't like that. When immersed, when you're working at your best, what kind of immersed is that immersed?
What kind of immersed is that immersed? So it's immersed to the extent that I can feel what's happening around me. Mm-hmm. So, excuse me, I need to cough for a second. I have a bit of a cold. So I can feel what's happening around me, and I can and I use that information to I guess navigate my way along with whatever it is that's happening. So sometimes that might be about swimming with the current or swimming against the current. Sometimes it might be just about lying on top and being still and just letting it take me. Other times it might be where it's kind of head above the water, but other times it might be diving down to the bottom. So the immersion is to do with every sense is attuned to what's happening both around and within me. So in terms of how I'm feeling, how it feels for me, how it feels for other people, but there's also elements of looking back and looking forward. So it most of the time it's in where I am right now in that river, but there's also occasions where there's a look up ahead to see what's coming, what's there, because that helps me be able to navigate that. But also, where have I been, what's been before, so that can, because that informs what's happening now as well. So if I can be attuned to where we are with a reference point of where we've been and where we're going, then that equips me most effectively to deal with whatever follows.
Mm-hmm. And attuned to where you are.
Yes.
Like that. And when you are attuned like that, what kind of attuned is that attuned, when you're attuned to where you are?
So it's I find it hard to articulate sometimes, because it's about being wholly in it, but also slightly detached. Mm-hmm. So it's being so I guess I come back to something I said earlier on, where so there's one thing which is about being aware of what's happening around me and then just letting that take me somewhere. So I could think, right, I'm drawn to go this way or that way, or to do this or to do that. So that's what's happening around me draws me to do that. But that's almost constantly held with a curiosity of, why do you want to do that? Is that the right thing for now? Is to what extent is that going to help you get to where it is you or this situation wants you to get? So for me, it's the distinction between being passive and being active in it. So it's not passively just allowing it to take you wherever it takes you. It's yes, being wholly in it and feeling it and understanding what's happening, but then making very deliberate choices around how to work with that. Now, the choice, if there might be a choice to let it go and to go with it, but there might be another choice to say, actually, no, I don't want to go there yet. We're going to hold where we are for now. We're going to stand our ground for a moment, because we need to stand our ground, and then we're going to hold it here, see what happens if we continue to hold it here, see how long we can hold it for, and again, knowing why we're holding it and what the intent is and the purpose is and those sorts of things. But it's that balance between being wholly aware of what's happening, but that I guess countered, for want of a better phrase, with the deliberate and purposefulness of the choices that we make around it.
Mm-hmm. So it's that balance between wholly aware and that deliberate choices, like that. Whereabouts is that balance?
I don't know. I don't know, because I've never been asked that question before. It's in me, I think, but I'm not willing or able, and I don't know which one of those it is, to give it a more specific locale than that.
So it's in you, but you're not willing or able to give it a more specific locale than that.
Yeah, so because it's not in my, because I can't say it's in my head, and I can't say it's in my gut, and I can't say it's in my heart or my chest, or because it's in all of those places and none of those places, which doesn't make any sense, but and because it's not about intuition either, because sometimes my intuition will say, go here. My intuition is telling me to go or to stop, or but then I look to validate what my intuition tells me with what data, and this is, I guess, getting into something slightly different in terms of, so if my intuition is saying, right, let it go and move, then another part of me will say, okay, so what's the data to support that moving is the right thing now? So you chose to hold here for a reason. You chose to hold here for these reasons. To what extent have those reasons either been negated or addressed, and therefore we're going to move? So if I put that into a coaching scenario, if I'm working with a client and there's a question that I've asked, I guess in a way, I'm going meta now. So I guess in a way similar to the question you've just asked me about where is it that they're really struggling with, my intuition might say, I feel uncomfortable with their discomfort. Mm-hmm. So they're uncomfortable at the moment. I feel uncomfortable about that. So my intuition says move it on. But then another part of me might say, well, actually, there's a reason why you asked that question. There's a reason why this bit is important. So no, we're going to hold for longer and let it be, even though they're uncomfortable and you're uncomfortable. You're still going to hold it anyway.
And the balance is not in your head or your heart or your gut or your chest. It's sort of all of those places and none of them. And your intuition, whereabouts is your intuition?
Again, it's similar in that it's in all of those places, but none. So it's within me, but and it's really interesting because the thought went through my head just then was, I had a feeling of being under pressure to say my gut. Mm-hmm. So I interpreted your question to be you putting pressure on me to say that's where to situate it somewhere, to situate it in my gut, and my long pause was because I was checking myself then to go, okay, well, why it's interesting that you've got that meaning. B, is it there? And C, are you saying it's not there just because you're trying to be awkward? And I answered all those questions to say, actually, no, I'm not trying to be awkward, and it's the same answer that I've given before in terms of it is in all those places but none of those places. So it's I can't put a pin in it to say that's where it is.
And that process that just happened, is that the same or different to the process you described a moment ago about the relationship between intuition and balance?
So it's very similar. So it's yes. So very very. Is it the same? I don't know. I wasn't willing to say it was the same. Again, because I think I hadn't thought about it in that way. But yes, it's very similar to that process, because it's so something somewhere inside me chose to hear it as what I just said I heard it as, and then another part of me was like, hang on a minute though, that because is there, and so yes, it's similar.
Mm-hmm. So there's that balance, there's that intuition, there's that process, and when you're immersed in your work, every sense is attuned, and there's that balance between the wholly aware of what's happening and that deliberate seeking the data and all of that. And all of that, is there anything else about you when you're working at your best and all of that?
So yes, and there's a lot of love in there because I love what I do. So there's and that is because I choose that word deliberately because it's not about joy. So there is a lot of joy in what I do, but it's not just about joy. So yes, I enjoy a lot of what I do, but I also love what I do because what I do can get me scared and get me cross and get me annoyed and get me offended and get me contemptuous at times, actually. But I love what I do because love it incorporates all of those things. It's not just about joy. Love isn't just about being happy, in my humble view. I love what I do because of the ways that it affects me, how it makes me feel, what it makes me think, and all of those things that go with it.
Mm-hmm. And when all of that, what difference does having explored all of that make?
So it's made me. It's been interesting to make me think about how do I articulate it, because I haven't articulated it like that before, so that's interesting. It's helpful in that it's got me considering where are things situated. Do I want to situate things? So I'm saying I can't put a pin in something, it's here but it's not here. So it's got me thinking, is that something that I want to do? Right now I'm not sure if it is, but it's an interesting thought process to have. And I've enjoyed the self-reflection on the meaning that I'm getting from the questions that you ask. And I guess that part of that is with the knowledge of where the conversation is going to go in the future within this podcast as well. So there's like there's a momentary and meta analysis thing that are going on together at the same time.
Thank you. So is that a good place to hand the chair back to you?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, so there was lots of using my language within the questions that you asked. Is that I'm guessing that? Sorry, no. Try again, Phil. There was lots of questions, lots of my language that I use in the questions that you asked me. Is that a deliberate thing?
Yes. So the clean language questions, which were devised by this bloke David Grove, are basically a set of about a dozen questions which have spaces in them for the other person's words. So the question patterns are relatively rigid. So people might have heard that I probably only asked three, maybe four questions in the whole of that conversation. But each time they were different because they had different of your words dropped into them.
Yeah.
So that was one of the amazing things that David discovered, that actually just a very small number of questions was enough to support somebody on making an inquiry into their own internal workings. The two most common questions, which are the ones I use most of the time, are what kind of X, where X represents some of your words, or is there anything else about X? And that's pretty much all you do with clean language. It is at one level incredibly simple, just a small number of questions, the other person's words, jobs are good.
And as a practitioner, when you studied David Grove's work, or when you started doing that, how did you feel about that? And there's an agenda behind my question, which I'll share in a minute.
Well, for me, it seemed absolutely natural because my professional background was a news reporter.
Oh, okay.
And I was the kind of news reporter who'd been trained that everybody else has a story. It's your job to find it and help them to tell it. I'm not the kind of news reporter you see on TV whose main role is to be a personality. In the tradition that I was taught, the reporter should be as invisible as possible. So for me, it seemed very natural and very comfortable as a concept, but it took what I already did and magnified it hugely. I thought I was already being clean in the technical meaning of the word clean, saying that I was doing minimal influence, but actually what I realized was that I was influencing all over the place. And that actually I could go a lot further and find, and the further I went into using their words and minimizing my words, the more I discovered, the more I learned. And that's when it got interesting.
Because I said there was an agenda behind my question, and the agenda behind it is that I'm aware of a number of that's not the right phrase. So I've worked with a number of people who pride themselves on their ability to craft a question. So almost and having a massive question bank, it's having a huge arsenal of questions at their disposal. And so the idea of only needing 10, I don't know where I got the number from, I can't remember if you said it earlier on, but the idea of only needing 10, I could imagine being they could interpret that as quite threatening, quite challenging, as rather than having this huge arsenal or armory of questions to ask.
And I think that touches on the sort of the heart of the purpose of clean language. It's an inquiry technique, and if you're working in a change context, so if you're wanting to help somebody to make changes in their life, for example, in a coaching context, traditionally, NLP coaches and various other kinds of coaching, the coach comes in with the powerful question which completely reframes the situation and changes the way the other person thinks about the thing. That only works very, very occasionally. It's actually much more powerful to help the other person to understand it for themselves differently, which is a subtle distinction, but it's a really important distinction. So in NLP, you'll get things like slate of mouth questions and meta model questions, the purpose of which is to undermine the client's sense of how the world is by introducing new content from the facilitator, from the coach. But actually, the underpinning assumption of clean language is that 99 times out of 100, that's not the bit that's needed. Particularly in these days of us having the internet at our fingertips, if more information or more perspectives on the same situation was going to change things, it would have changed it by now. What really is going to make the difference is something from inside the client shifting. Now, that is potentially disempowering if your entire professional career is built on amazing questions that completely transform the client's world. But actually, if you're in that kind of mindset, you may like to pay attention to how often those powerful questions actually work, what effect they actually have, rather than the effect you wish they had.
So in my head, I'm now searching my experiences of my coaching practice and going, I wouldn't, what's been the impact when I've tried to ask those, context shattering questions.
And I'm not denying that sometimes they work. Sometimes questions can be awesome. And sometimes clean language questions can be used in an unclean way where they actually do challenge the way someone's thinking about it. In one of my learning groups online, we're having a discussion at the moment about, so if the client says, I feel that people are judging me, is it or is it not a clean question to say, how many people could there be? Now, how many is technically a clean question. It's a specialized one. It's not one of the core 12, but it's one of the extended set of about 20.
Okay.
And the client has said there are multiple people in their internal world. I feel that people are judging me. So at one level, it's a perfectly reasonable and curious question to, how many people could there be? But another level, that's effectively a meta-model question. It's an NLP meta-model question in which you're asking, do you really mean that all people are judging you?
Yes.
Challenging that universal quantifier. So it's possible to use clean language questions to be completely unclean and to try and fix the client.
Yeah.
But David's big insight was that clients don't need fixing. If you can open a space, if you can allow with your listening and your attention to open them to have a space to do their best thinking, their systems have the power to heal themselves. They don't need your magic wand.
And I love that as a starting point. You know, I think I mentioned last time when we spoke before we set the date for the podcast, I mentioned Nancy Klein's work, and I'm a huge fan of Nancy Klein's work. And the more we're discussing it, the more overlap I'm making. Whether that's a fair thing to do or not is another question. But the more overlap I'm making between her work and the work we're talking about here. So it's prompting me to want to go and read more and to immerse myself in it more.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to pay attention, because Nancy's work is absolutely awesome. And so there's a lot in Nancy's work about providing space for people to talk. Yeah. She says things like the quality of your attention determines the quality of another person's thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely in the same kind of territory as clean. Where we diverge is in Nancy's concept of the incisive question.
Yes.
Which is absolutely the kind of question which you're talking about, where the listener suddenly switches role, and instead of just being curious, says, right, I can craft a question which is going to transform everything. David's idea was, don't do that. You don't need to do that.
So can I go back to the example for a second? So the client was saying that people are judging me. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
So what? So we talked about the question of how many people.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be an alternative then? So what would be an alternative clean question that you could ask?
The classic clean question in response to that statement would be, and when you feel people are judging you, what would you like to have happen?
Okay.
Now, at one level, that's it's got a less clean intention than just curiosity.
Yes, true.
For most people, most of the time, it's more useful to be paying attention to what they like than what they don't like, to resources and to outcomes, rather than to problems and the general messiness of the past.
Yeah, okay.
So most clean language coaches will use that attention switching question to help someone to look at what they would like instead. David Grove, on the other hand, didn't do that. He used to talk about being an equal information employer. And he thought that constant focus on outcomes was inappropriate, that people should actually keep this sense of curiosity and instead just ask another question that would take the person to the edge of what they already knew and to find out something else that they didn't already know. So when you could ask, so the original statement was, I feel people are judging me. David might ask, and when you feel people are judging you, and when feel, whereabouts is feel?
Okay. Because
David was really, really interested in psychogeography, about the notion that people's thoughts and feelings and experience was entirely physically grounded. We're not disembodied brains in jars. We are human beings in bodies in relation to environments. And our thoughts are held in physical space one way or another. And because David was working with trauma, one of the things he wanted to do was get his clients more into their bodies and less and out of their heads.
Okay.
Because in resolving trauma, typically it's a very visceral body reaction that needs to happen to resolve traumatic conditions.
And are we talking physical trauma or psychological trauma or both?
Both in the cases that he was dealing with.
Okay.
So there are a bunch of alternative questions, and of course you could just ask, and when you feel people are judging you, what kind of judging?
Hmm.
And what you can notice by having this very, very small question set, you can go to some amazingly different places.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though you've just got this small question set, the other person's words, and an intention to be curious rather than to try and fix it.
Because one of the other things I'm really interested in is the world of kind of framing and metaphor, which I've put together as one, and actually they're two distinctly different things. And I was curious about how, because there's me framing it as curiosity. So I was curious about the way or ways that clean language would use those two things. So I guess in a way, if I'm understanding it correctly, there can be some framing within it, but the metaphor is about recycling or reflecting back, depending on which word you want to use, the metaphor that the individual, the client, whether that be in a coaching or in a team setting, it's using their metaphor to encourage further exploration, and the frame can be, where is that? So the example, if I'm understanding it correctly, in the example you said just now around where is that judging, then the frame you're putting around it is that it has a physical place, and it presupposes it has a physical place, but the thing that you're reflecting back is the metaphor that's been used. Is that a fair or accurate description?
It's a slightly complicated one, because framing is itself a metaphor and means lots of different things to different people.
Yeah. Okay.
And every metaphor is unique to an individual, and we share common frames within cultures. So that there's a whole bunch of different energies combined in that question. When one is asking a clean language question, typically you're looking to find out information as the facilitator, but much more importantly, to help the client find out what's happening for themselves. You're trying to impose as few frames, as few rigid structures as you can, in order for them to have the maximum freedom of movement. But one of the things is that constraint inspires creativity. So when you ask a clean language question, you are directing attention with precision. You're not just vaguely going, oh, is there anything else about all of that? So, which just really just allows the client to carry on thinking the way they've always been thinking. So if we start off with, I feel that people are judging me, and you go, oh, is there anything else about that? Well, no new thinking is going to emerge from that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But by directing the client's attention with pinpoint precision to, is there anything else about those people? Then you basically take the attention to a bit they haven't already paid attention to.
Yeah, okay.
David wanted the attention taken to just the edge of what they know now, and not wildly beyond, but just at the edge. So in his way of seeing it, getting the answer, I don't know, to a question was not a disaster. It doesn't matter when the client says, "Oh, I don't know. I've never been asked that before." You're encouraging them to do new thinking. And even a small bit of new thinking is potentially making a change in the system. A lot of your listeners will be very much systems thinking. They'll have the idea that if, everything within the system influences everything else, if you can change one piece, lots of the other things might change. So a small change in thinking, expanding the thinking in one direction or another, might change a lot of things. So when we take the attention to what the person wants, to the intended outcome, or as an appreciative inquiry, take the attention to what's working, what's going really well, that expands the frame of our thinking. We're discovering something new. So the whole space in which we think becomes larger, more things are then able to change, and more connections can be made and all the rest of it. So I've gone off on a bit of a riff around framing.
No, it's okay.
But is that some kind of answer to your question?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Excuse me, coughing again. So it wasn't some kind of answer to my question. It was a thorough answer to my question. So thank you. And so the experience that I had then, where I interpreted, or the meaning I took from one of your questions, was that you were forcing me to a particular place. Is that because I suppose I'm linking a few things together, which may be inappropriate for me to do. We talk about precision inquiry, and then if I think about that in the context of the discussion that we had, that precision made me uncomfortable, and it caused a reaction in me of I feel like I'm being told I have to situate this somewhere. Is that, in your experience, is that common?
I think this absolutely gets into the nub of the conversation that brought us together in the first place. The idea that people cannot influence each other is utter nonsense.
Yeah.
And the idea that when one person is asking another person very specific questions that they are not influencing is utter tosh. It's right up there on the toshness scale.
The toshiness scale, yeah.
But what I was doing, the way I understand what I was doing, is I was directing your attention with precision. It's like, you see those big spotlights that are manually operated. You see them in pantomimes, and they chase the character around on the stage.
Yeah.
And there's a bloke, typically a bloke, I've done it, it can be done by a woman, typically a bloke up in the lighting gallery with that spotlight chasing the character around the stage. And all of a sudden there'll be a little noise and the spotlight moves to a different part of the stage, and the character has to run to follow the spotlight. That's what questions do. They take the person's attention, like the character on the stage, the attention is pulled hither and yon by questions. Which means that and there's another little loop.
Okay.
What happens when you are asked a question? Your attention goes inside to seek the answer to the question. So whenever I ask a question, even if you've got no intention of answering it, your attention follows the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that is to do with societal rules and norms that mean that it's impolite. So the amount of time it took me to give you the answer, I don't know, because I felt like I should give you an answer, And I think this is back to where where I felt that pressure to situate it somewhere, because it was a similar question that you'd asked in a slightly different way. There was a bit of social pressure that's put on myself to say you need to situate this somewhere, because you've been asked about it twice now. You've been asked where it is twice, and you gave an I don't know last time, and you can't give I don't know again because that would be rude or impolite or those sorts of things. So I agree with you. When the question is asked, you will go. There is a norm, very much so, to go and find, to go and look for the answer. And if the answer is then I don't know, then so be it. But it's really, really hard to hear the question, where is that feeling, and answer breakfast cereal. Yes. Yeah.
And where attention goes, energy flows. So by directing someone's attention to one thing in preference to another thing, you are directing their energy. So a coach who always directs the person's attention to what they want in preference to what they don't want is directing the person's energy to what they want, as well as their attention. So that's I've lost track of what the original question was.
That's okay.
But the notion of what you're doing is not influencing. You are influencing. You're influencing the person's attention and the person's energy, and directing them in specific ways. What you're not doing is trying to fix them. And what you're not doing, as far as possible, is introducing your own content as the facilitator.
Yeah. So
I'm not sitting around going, oh, and when you're working at your best, it's like a river. Is that like the River Thames near me? Or is it more like the Humber near you?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not introducing rivers. And I'm also not... and I'm being more led by you and your answers than by a formula. So I don't think I actually asked you any questions about the river, apart from the very first one, because you'd said you didn't like that metaphor. And there was something else that you were talking about, which was about immersion.
Yes. So
although there were some moments at which I thought you were still talking about a river, I thought let's leave those. Let's pay attention to some of the other pieces. So you did at one point talk about sometimes I'm swimming with the flow, and sometimes I'm swimming against it, and sometimes I dive, and sometimes I'm resting on the surface. So probably there was a river in the metaphor, but actually river was not the central focus of our inquiry at that point.
No.
We might have gone on to talk more about river, but we might not. So I'm much more being led by you and what you are wanting to explore, than by a book thing that says, oh, he said the word river, let's keep going back to that.
Yeah.
So it's different levels of content imposition. You're trying not to impose content, you are trying to impose, or you are imposing the direction of energy through the direction of attention.
And I guess that's back to to one of the phrases that you opened up with, which is about precision inquiry.
Okay. I'm really curious. This toshiness spectrum.
Yes.
Is there anything else about a toshiness spectrum? I want to know what this toshiness spectrum's like.
So I think that there's that's a tough question to answer. So I like spectrum as a general thing. I like spectrums as ways of exploring things, and so on a toshiness spectrum, there's one end which is complete and utter tosh, and has no either, and there's a mix of things. It could be no practical application, it could be no evidence base behind it, no foundation for it, and then At the other end of the spectrum, there is, I guess, the opposite of those things. Yeah. I think I like spectrums because they give freedom to say that, it removes the binariness of it. So it's not right or wrong, or correct or incorrect, or black or white. It's the range of the range that can be in it, because nothing is as simple as clean or dirty, or to take, if I go with clean language, I know that there is no clean or dirty. So if we look at language as clean or dirty, I think that gives us an unhelpful binary perspective on it.
And I hate the name clean language, by the way. I think it's a really, really unhelpful name for a thing which is much more interesting than that and more useful. Because it's not really about language either. It's about metaphor. And metaphor goes much deeper than language. The reason there's metaphor in our language is because there's metaphor in our thoughts.
Yes.
It's not, the suggestion that it's clean language also is not only that it suggests there's a perfect cleanness, but also suggests that there is a language focus to the thing. But actually, you can use clean language questions about all sorts of things. It doesn't have to be about words. You can use them about body movements and all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, because I was imagining, as well as in the coaching and kind of team development world, there could also be applications within the consulting perspective as well. So in terms of so one of the things that I get really interested in is when I'm asked to do some consulting work, is exploring the reality or the realities of what's happening wherever I'm being asked to work. So I can imagine using those questions to explore those those realities that are present for the different people that are involved would be a really interesting one.
Indeed, you've got various applications in that kind of point. This is one of the places where clean language has got academic support, by the way, just to pay attention to your Toshiness criteria.
Yeah. Clean
language is increasingly being used as a methodology for academic interviewing. And James Lawley, who's one of the key people in the clean language world, has established effectively a cleanness analysis tool. And if you're doing a research survey, he can run your questions through his analysis tool and tell you how clean you're being.
That's really interesting.
Which actually can be really handy in a whole bunch of situations. But in the situation you described, so you've got to, in a consulting situation, first you can use clean language to find out what it is the person potentially hiring you actually would like to have happen as a result of hiring you.
Yes.
Now, typically, that's a place where consulting projects go horribly wrong, because you don't have a clear sense of what they want. You're too anxious to say, oh, what you have is a nail and what I've got is a hammer. And they're anxious also for you to have a hammer for their nail. But really, you never get to find out what the actual situation is that is causing them to call you in. So there's this whole piece of sort of clean scoping of what is the project that is required. And that in itself, because being asked clean language questions typically deepens the relationship between the client and the facilitator really, really quickly.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So it's very handy to ask your potential client clean language questions, because although it's a little bit of a trick, it will make them feel that you understand them really well. And hence they're potentially more likely to hire you. Once you've got the gig, then, as you say, establishing current reality, you're already in there using the questions to find out what's actually going on for people. And in the same moment of doing that, you're building their relationship with you, and potentially you're teaching them tools which can build the relationships within the organization you're going into.
Yeah.
So you're already doing it. You're already making the intervention in the bit where they think that you're just fact-finding. And then as it goes on, maybe you do your official report back and you say, well, what I think we should do is this, and you diagnose, you say, right, we should do some training or some coaching, and then you're again teaching people to use these questions is a way of teaching them to be more curious about each other. And my colleague Caitlin Walker would say, in the process, the system becomes aware of itself. What she mean? Well, I think what I understand her to mean by that.
I was going to say, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
What does she mean by that?
Is that as people become more aware of each other and more aware of the interactions between people and more aware of the results of the interactions between people, they can start to direct attention in ways that potentially change that. When an individual is being coached using clean language, stuff that just changes. So the example I often use is a client I had recently who his metaphorical landscape, he had it was like there were blocks scattered all over a field.
Okay.
And I asked him questions about these different blocks. I suppose they must have been to do with different aspects of his career. I was asking him about different blocks, and we've been going for about 15 minutes. He suddenly went, "Oh!" I said, "What just happened?" He said, "Oh, the blocks have picked themselves up and formed themselves into a staircase."
Okay.
And I asked him some questions about the staircase, and the next thing that happened was a flaming portal opened up at the top of the staircase, and he was able to go up the staircase, walk through the flaming portal, and his stuff was sorted. I know one of the downsides of being a clean language coach, you never really understand what they meant by the metaphor.
No.
But the bit I wanted to share was the surprise, the sense of surprise. When the metaphor changes, everything changes.
Yeah.
Something similar seems to happen when groups and teams really get using these questions and using their metaphors together. At the very simplest level, they discover that one person is when they're working at their best, they're like an express train, and another person, when they're working at their best, they're like a butterfly. And now they understand why they're not quite seeing eye to eye. But as it goes deeper, they can understand, well, what is it that the butterfly needs to be in place to be working at their best? Oh, they need the freedom to move from flower to flower. What is it the express train needs to be working at their best? Well, they need to be properly fueled and have a nice clear track to follow. And once you know that people need this stuff, the butterfly can make sure that the track's in place, and then they can float off.
Yeah.
It becomes much easier to work together when you know what people need. And until you start to get curious about your colleagues, you just don't know.
And what I really like about that is the way that it empowers the individual to create those things and articulate those things for themselves, as opposed to it being done as a result of completing a personality questionnaire or as a result of a doing a Belbin team roles thing. So rather than asking questions to then put yourself in a predisposed or prescribed box, it's about you being empowered and enabled to create those explanations and distinctions for yourself.
And it takes a lot less explanation than Belbin or any of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how many pages of assessment is it for a Belbin thing? It goes on forever. And in order to understand your colleague's one, you've got to read their so many pages as well as your own, and and so on and so forth. Whereas with a metaphor, just one line, when I'm working at my best, I'm like a butterfly, gives you so many clues, because metaphor captures so much information in a very, very small package. even though their butterfly will not be the same as my butterfly, we can have a sense of how butterflies are. We know what the metaphorical entailments of butterflies are, and what are the metaphorical entailments of express trains. So we already, before we even start to talk about more detail on those things, we already have a general sense.
Oh, it's been fascinating, Judy. I've really enjoyed it today.
It's always good to talk about this stuff. I'm now clicking back through your toshiness criteria and thinking, is there anything else we haven't covered in terms of toshiness criteria? We covered research. We've covered, I hope we've covered practical application.
Yeah, so yeah, we have, yeah.
Was there another criterion? I think there was a third.
There may have been, but I can't remember.
No,
what I'm really curious is, what difference has this conversation made for you? For someone who came to and before we've had a previous conversation, but when you first came to Clean Language, which is only about a month ago, we started talking on LinkedIn, I think it was.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
What difference, as having explored all of this stuff about Clean Language, what difference does it make?
So it sparked a curiosity that wasn't there before. So I was, I would wrinkle my nose up in disgust and turn away. When if I saw the words clean language in anything, I would just go whatever, and turn around and walk away. So whereas now you've got me really curious about the 12 core questions and the additional 20. The work that both David Grove and James Lawley are doing, because part of what I do is around. I will help organisations with some cultural diagnostic stuff, and I think I've got some really good, I'm going to use inverted commas, good questions, which I've again, and when you talk about the examples that you've shared with me today around what some of those 12 might be, I can see that the questions that I've got have elements of those within them already. So in terms of the precision but broad, so asking something that's precise but gives space and room to allow people to explore, the use of the interviewees or the group's language as a way of kind of presenting that back to explore that in more detail and explore that in more depth. So both in my work as a coach and a consultant as a facilitator, you've really got my curiosity piqued around what else is there then, and to go and find out more, read more, and just to go and interrogate it more. Whereas and that's all I say, that's almost, it's not an almost, that's a complete 180 from where I was before. So if you'd have said, where does clean language fit on your things that you want to go and investigate, I'd have said it's not even on a list. Whereas now it's very much on that list and something I want to investigate quickly.
Excellent. I rate that as a job done then. When you have got a moment to investigate it, some directions I suggest on my website. Please. judyrees.co.uk, there is a free ebook, Your Clean Language Questions Answered.
Fab, thank you.
Which does indeed answer a lot of your clean language questions. There will be, so that ebook is made up of blog posts from judyrees.co.uk. There are lots of others on that website. If it's a search function, you can find all sorts of stuff about clean language there, including.
I'll put a link to that in the in the show notes as well. So if people want to go and find it, they can just open the show notes and they can click on it and off it'll go.
I think that ebook includes a list of recommended books, but the very short list of recommended books, you might enjoy the book I co-authored, which is Clean Language: Revealing Metaphors and Opening Minds. If you're working primarily with groups, there are two others to pay attention to. Caitlin Walker's book, From Contempt to Curiosity, and it might sound a bit bizarre, but Julie McCracken's book, Clean Language in the Classroom. While it's, the substance of the book is about working with small children, most of what she does is also applicable to adults. And if people are coaches listening to this, then there's a book by Marion Way called Clean Approaches for Coaches, which is, again, very excellent. I've got various recorded courses online. I've got a weekly newsletter which brings out all sorts of stuff around all of this stuff. David Grove's own materials. David unfortunately died about 10 years ago, so he was around before people were mass producing YouTubes and those kind of things. So there isn't a huge amount of David's own material out there. It's most of what's usable is recent work by other people.
Fab.
Is there anything?
Wonderful.
Thank you. I'll make sure I find all those books and put links to them in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it has been fun. So can I take your question and kind of
play it back to you as well then? So the question you asked me was what was it? Remind me of the question you asked me.
The original question.
No, the one you asked me right at the end. So the what was it?
What difference does having explored all of this make?
Okay, good. So for you, Judy, what difference has exploring all of this made? It's been interesting. It's always interesting to share it with somebody new and compare and contrast your experience of it with my experience of it. It's good fun to talk about it and to think, I suppose it's about crafting the talking about clean language. Yeah. 10 years ago, I was as guilty as anybody of standing in the conference coffee area going, oh, clean language. Yes, clean language is about not influencing your clients. And it's just tosh. Tosh. So over the last 10 years, I've got better and better and better, I hope, at explaining why that's not true. And now I no longer feel guilty about saying it. It's not possible to be completely clean. And what's interesting is what happens when you give it your best shot and what you then learn. And I think that's a brilliant note to end on. So thank you so much for your time today, Judy. Really, really appreciate it. If people want to get hold of you, they can go to judyrees.co.uk, or is it .com? .co.uk. JudyRees.com is a real estate agent in America. Quite easy to distinguish. So judyrees.co.uk, then we'll make sure that's really clear. Thank you so much for your time, Judy, both today, but also in the conversation that we've had in the past and for our interactions online. And I look forward to chatting with you more as I go and explore clean language even more. Enjoy it. Wonderful. Thanks, Judy. Take care.
You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, written, recorded and presented by Phil Wilcox, edited together by Simon Leverton. You can find more information at emotionatwork.co.uk or follow us on Twitter at @PhilWilcox. Thanks for listening.